Hi, I'm George Nordhaus, and welcome to Monday Morning. Key considerations of agency acquisition and perpetuation is a subject that every agency has to be at some time or another interested in. And I have the opportunity here to interview David Tralka, who's President and CEO of InsurBanc, and I thought it was just perfect. David is the president and CEO of Connecticut Community Bank. He's been around for a long time in the banking business. And David, why InsurBank a division of?
I'm sorry, George. The InsurBank division is the product of work that was done by the Big I some 15 years ago to put a bank together to bring banking services, product, and capital to independent agencies. So InsurBank is a very specialized business for a fairly specialized clientele.
It really is. I see it advertised. And I used to be the Big I, one of the association executives for a couple of states, and so I've really been involved with the Big I all my life. And I was very impressed because nobody's ever done this, to my knowledge, have they? Nobody else has ever.
No. I think there's other institutions who try to have lines of business that work with independent agencies, but we were started by the association, we were grown by the association, and really we're part of the member benefits of being in the Big I as well.
Oh, good. Well, that's good background. Let's talk about, what are we going to talk about today?
Well, we're going to talk about a very broad topic that I'm going to try to narrow down into a couple of key points, and that's really what's going on in the M&A market, sort of points about valuation, specifically how do folks need to think about perpetuating or at least looking at options for succession planning in their agency. And then I do want to spend a few minutes just talking about how to access capital either as a buyer or making sure your agency is positioned so that it can be leveraged to have a transaction take place when a seller is ready to do a transaction. So we're going to talk about this issue, across a number of topics today.
Good. I like it that way. That's the best kind. Okay. Your move.
Thank you. Thanks, George. Well, I want to start with some of the market observations. And the reason I do that, I like to go back a couple of years because it gives you a feel for the context of what's going on in the M&A market today. And if you go back to 2012, there was a sunsetting of Bush-era tax laws, which drove a lot of activity in the marketplace. And that was really an unusual event. Sellers sold because they thought they would get capital gains preference or advantages, and that was a driver in activity. And that had been one of the busiest years to date. Once you got into 2013, things started to soften a little bit, and while agency owner demographics continued to move in a direction that we see today, where you have a fairly aging population of owners in the agency business, and there's always going to be sellers as folks think about retiring. But in 2013, early 2013, after the tax law changes went into effect, things softened a bit. And only later in the year did it start to accelerate, and accelerated through 2014, 15, and into 2016. And all these years have something very similar in common, and that's the fact that money has been historically cheap. And there are a lot of buyers who continue to be hungry. They're aggressive to buy cash flows that agencies deliver. And frankly, they're enabled because it is a low interest rate environment. And what they're buying is earnings potential, and they're buying future cash flows. So that's what's driving the marketplace today.
I noticed you said a key word there on a previous slide was announced. Because when you're announcing that doesn't mean that there's got to be a lot more than that.
Absolutely. That is announced. People know what's going on. This is not the transaction that was done between neighbors or community folks that nobody knows about. So the number is dramatically larger than that, but the announced deals are the ones that folks keep track of.
Got it. Okay.
When we think about the interest rate environment, this is important because what a low rate environment does is it drives equity markets. And the way to think about it is when rates are low, stocks are high, typically. And when stocks are high, public broker stocks are high. And when public broker stocks are high, they have currency in order to do transactions. And what public brokers are able to do as acquisitors is pay higher prices because their stock is worth more. And of course, when rates are low, borrowing money is cheaper. So folks who are buyers and they use leverage or use loans, well, they've got increased buying power. So you think about it like you can always buy a bigger house if mortgage rates are low because you can afford a larger mortgage. The flip side to this, however, is you have to really think about stress testing the market when rates start to move the other way. And while low rates drove a lot of activity, when rates turn and start to go up, it will curtail activity. And in that case, valuations will either stabilize or in a very high rate environment may be retarded in terms of the amount of activity that goes on and the valuations that are being paid. And folks like to time this market, and that's difficult. But if you pay attention to the Federal Reserve and you hear what they're saying, you get a pretty good sense of what might be going on in the rate environment. So that's a big driver over the last 3 years. As long as money stays cheap, you're going to see valuations be high and activity be vibrant.
Right.
Now, when we talk about, when we talk about succession planning, I always like to use a little snapshot. This is a real live agency. It's a little bit of a case study I want to go through, and this is a pretty typical agency. It's a family agency, been around for a long time. We're going to go back to 2012 when they had $11 million in premium. They had about $1.4 million in commissions, and they had a 2/3, 1/3 split between commercial lines and personal lines. And the seller, or the owner, he was 95% owner, and he had gotten the agency from a family member in 1998, and he hadn't really thought about selling until somebody knocked on his door, unsolicited, and made him an offer. And it was an aggressive offer, and he got very excited about taking advantage of the capital gains environment of the time. A CPA, who was his brother-in-law, recommended that this was great timing for this, and he went all in to sell. He didn't really think he had any other options. He didn't really think about anybody inside the agency. He just got excited about the number, and off he went. And so we're going to call the buyer the original buyer, and then we're going to talk about the internal buyer who comes on the scene later. But the original buyer, this external third party who jumped into the game and made the unsolicited offer, they had a ton of cash. They were a financial buyer. And George, I'm going to talk about financial and strategic buyers in a second. What they were seeking is operational leverage. And for folks out there, what that means is they were going to take advantage of the revenue streams and cut as many costs as they could. So as a financial buyer, they were thinking about the dollars and cents of the post-transaction agency. And that's something that we're going to address in a second as well. The potential internal buyer who really didn't get a sniff at the transaction originally was the 5% owner. They were somebody who'd been with the agency for some time. They didn't have a lot of liquidity. They didn't have a lot of personal net worth. And so they were never deemed to be an option for the seller. What ended up happening is the seller got the offer, the buyer came in and did their due diligence, and they backed out. And they backed out in December of 2012. Remember, our seller had already mentally checked out. He had sort of spent the money. The third party refused to buy the
Been there and done that, yeah, right. Yeah.
Because they had looked at the numbers and they said, well, gee, these are not really great financial statements. We don't really know what's going on. There's nothing untoward about them. They were just not up to snuff. And the other problem that the buyer had was that the agency owned its building inside the company, and they didn't want the real estate. Remember, they were looking for operating leverage. They wanted to glean as much, cost out of the situation as they could, and having a building really wasn't what they wanted to do. They were thinking in terms of consolidating offices and didn't want the real estate.
Right.
And so the way agencies are structured sometimes have a problem. But here's a situation where, it's similar to somebody walking up, knocking on your front door and say, hey, I want to buy your house for $1 million. And you say, great. And then your spouse says, well, where are we going to live tomorrow? And so that was what happened here. It was one of these, they got all excited, and the deal fell apart. So he missed the window on the tax law changes, and he had a situation that left him high and dry. But he was already thinking about retirement. So he ended up talking to us as it turned out, and we helped them with an advisor to work on an internal perpetuation structure for that 5% owner. And it took about 1.5 years of, let's call it financial re-engineering, getting the agency to move the building out of the agency, set up a different structure, and the transaction actually took place. Sold at 2 times revenue, 2 times commission rather. It ended up being a $3.2 million price. It was done with a loan. The equity that the buyer brought to the table was their 5%. The seller took a note back, so we did a bit of a structured transaction. But at the end of the day, the deal was done, and the agency was perpetuated internally. And the point of emphasis here that I just want to spend time on is, if you're unprepared to entertain an offer, and whether it's because of the way you set your agency up or the way you run it, you may, in fact, put yourself in a position of being disappointed. And so getting evaluation, getting good people, getting experts on your side is critical. Making sure you're doing all the right things to build agency value over time. Understanding how much an agency can support in financing early in the process, before you might need it, because that'll tell you what kind of structures you might be able to do. And if you're running your agency well, you're going to create more value, and you're going to have an easier time both obtaining financing and getting a deal done.
Does that, excuse me, David, that, when you say contract a third-party valuation, are you talking about the bank? Or are you talking about a consultant, an outside consultant?
I'm talking about a consultant. The bank doesn't do valuations. We value agencies for the purpose of lending money, but that's for our purposes, and we have our own models. Mm-hmm. But in order for somebody to have a good understanding of the value of their agency and of their asset, and most importantly, what the drivers of those values, so they can work on them over time to increase value, is critical. And I'm going to talk about valuation in a second, George, because there's something known as country club multiples. And country club multiples are what people think agencies sell for, and they really don't. And so we're going to spend a minute or two on valuation in a second.
Good.
There really are already a couple alternatives to succession planning, if you think about it. You can sell to a related third party, and that's internal, right? And that's your colleagues, your partners, producers, management. And those people are folks you've hired and you've put in your agency, and they become really good options, and they became the option in our little case study. Folks often think about merging with another agency, and I view that as okay, but that sort of kicks the can down the road, because eventually a deal is going to have to be done, whether it's as a merged entity or as a single entity. And the third is where we started with our case study, which is selling to an unrelated third party. And there are 2 types of unrelated third parties. There's a strategic buyer and there's a financial buyer. And your strategic buyer is maybe a competitor, somebody in town, somebody has the same market, same lines of business, same geography. They're thinking strategically. Mm-hmm. Financial buyer, well, that's a private equity group. I write PEG on my slide, but that's a private equity group who's looking to roll up a lot of agencies, extract some costs, and figure out how to get operating leverage. And they're motivated differently. And so those are your options when you think about succession planning. Now, perspective's different depending on whether you're a buyer or a seller. If you're a buyer, it doesn't matter what type of buyer, you're thinking of, when you look at an agency, you're thinking about doing due diligence, understanding the technology platform, who the people on the staff are, where your markets are, what kind of relationships you have. If I'm going to leverage, borrow money to do it, can I get capital? What's my personal financial situation look like? Or what is our capital availability? Things like that. You're a seller. You're thinking about a few different things. You're thinking about what's in it for me, and what are the tax considerations? How do I make sure I don't send more money to Uncle Sam than I need to? And how do I make sure I'm getting the optimum price, maximizing my value? What's the right timing? The intangibles. And George, this is something that is important to a lot of sellers, and that is, my family's name is on the door, or my employees are very important to me, or my customers are very important to me. And I call them intangible. They're tangible, but I call them intangibles to differentiate themselves from some of the other things. And it's important. And so if you sell to a financial buyer who's going to change the name on the agency, well, that might be important to you, and you might not want to go that path. Everybody's a little different, but these are things you need to think of. What's the day one view of that agency after the transaction happens? What's going to happen to the people? What's going to happen to the customers? What's going to happen to the appointments? What's going to happen to the name on the door? Things like that. And one part of this is making sure that you get ahead of the curve. And folks always ask me, gee, Dave, how long should I, when should I start? And I always say, 5 years, 4 years, think ahead. It gives you time to change direction if you need to improve things. It gives you a chance to sort of come to grips with your own, sort of identity in the transaction. What are you going to do after you sell? How are you going to help the buyer? Are you going to help the buyer? What's the emotions involved in doing this? After doing something for 20 or 30 years and not doing it on a day in the future, what does that mean? It gives you time to find a qualified buyer, because having a qualified buyer in-house gives you an opportunity to move the needle in a direction you want. It gives you an opportunity to stage your exit. You can, if you don't have somebody in-house, you can look at who your logical competitors are and see if they want to have a dialogue. And sometimes there's a buy-sell situation where, you have an agreement to buy each other out if the time is right. And then you have a chance to talk to the buyer about what they want, what they're trying to do, and to identify whether or not these are the folks you really want to sell to. And what we've learned from inadequate planning is you end up expending a lot of time, energy, and money to get nothing. And that's what happened with our case study. There was no planning, there was no sense. They jumped into a transaction, it fell apart, and it cost them a lot of time, energy, and money. We talk about financial versus strategic, and this is where I was referring to this earlier. They have a different idea of value. Right? They think about transactions differently. They think about the legacy, the employees, the intangibles. They think differently in terms of how the structure might be. If I'm a cash buyer, I might be willing to pay a certain amount of money, but if I have to go borrow money, perhaps I have a different view. I have this thing called concept of unproductive debt. If you do an internal perpetuation and I sell my agency to you, George, and you have to borrow money, well, you're using the agency to borrow that money. And that puts a big slug of debt on the head or on top of that agency. And it's not productive debt. It's not like I went and hired a couple of producers or bought a book. It doesn't create any revenue. It's unproductive. Necessary, but unproductive. And can the agency deal with that? Can it support it? And that oftentimes is the difference between one structure for a transaction or another. And so financial and strategic buyers ultimately have a different perspective. Internal and external buyers have a different perspective, and it usually ends up in what the ultimate price that gets paid. Now, we'll take a breath. We went through a lot of stuff quickly, but I did talk about value, and I want to do a 2-second sort of tutorial on value because I think it's important, and folks get sideways on this topic often. Value is very simple. It has 2 sources. You value your earnings and you value your stuff, and that's the balance sheet. Well, the stuff is sort of easy to figure out what you got because you know what it is. It's tangible. You can touch it. You know what the desks are worth. You know what the carpet is worth. You know what the balance sheet has. Earnings are a little bit squirrelier, and you have to combine the 2 to get to the ultimate value. But when you value earnings, you're trying to figure out what does the agency actually make in terms of cash flow from what it's supposed to be doing. And that's called, in my view, pro forma profitability. You reconfigure, you rejigger the numbers, and you say, okay, this is what the agency is supposed to make from what it's supposed to be doing. And how risky are those earnings? Is there a lot of volatility in them? And that'll help determine the ultimate deal structure at the end of the day. Earnings are defined as a couple ways. You'll hear folks refer to it as EBITDA, and that's earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. It's also known as cash flow, and that's the phrase I will use is cash flow. And you adjust that cash flow or those earnings for making sure that, if you overpay yourself, well, you bring that compensation level down to market levels. Are you paying your producers at the appropriate level or normalized level? Are your contingencies normalized? Because you can't do a value based on maybe there's a big contingency down the road. You have to eliminate the perks and other expenses, and you have to have a good sense of what the future retention is of that book. And that gives you the quantity of earnings as you look at the business going forward. And that's something you can value. There is a myth to the multiples, and multiples come in 2 sort of flavors. There's a multiple of revenue, how much times commissions did that agency sell for, and then there's a multiple of cash flow or EBITDA. That means what's the multiplier to the earnings stream. And the problem with multiples is that the available transaction data is crummy. There's no real good place to find. So the integrity of data is not really that solid. So folks have wide and varied perceptions of value being paid. And public buyers and private buyers pay different numbers. When banks were big buyers and now private equity groups are buyers, they tend to overpay. And so they sort of screw up the model a little bit. And so prices, if I sold to a bank, in 2002, I might have gotten a huge premium to what other agencies might have sold at. And that's changed, and that always is moving in and out. But you always have to look at who the buyers are when folks talk about what multiple and how big an agency, and what was the structure. Really, was it a multiple or was there an earn-out involved? And that's the real number. And that's why I call them country club multiples. You can't believe what you hear just because you're on the golf course with somebody. Like, it's like your fishing buddy who told you caught the 400-pound tuna, and then you see the picture and you realize that, well, it wasn't quite 400 pounds and it wasn't quite a tuna. And so you really can't believe everything you hear when you talk about multiples. I mean, you noticed in that case study the multiple that was paid for that agency was 2 times commission. Mm-hmm. And agency multiples, as a function of commission, have always sort of wrapped around that 1.5 to 2.5 times.
Right.
And that's and it depends. And when you think about agency multiples today as a function of EBITDA, or of cash flow, you're talking 6, 7, 8 times. Sometimes higher depending on the property, but there's always a range, and it is dependent upon a lot of things. Now, the other thing that what a valuation firm is going to look at is the quality of those earnings, and the quality of those earnings are really what drives the value, and that's the brand, the reputation, who's on the staff, what's the platform look like. And what folks need to realize, George, is that all earnings and revenue are not created equal. The value of personal passenger auto might be different to a buyer than the value of a small commercial lines book, or the value of a workers' comp book, or the value of a specialty book. And really what they're trying to figure out is, what's the risk of the future of this cash flow, both in terms of retention as well as the volatility of the customer base and the type. Are they heading into a hardened market, or are they going into a softened market? And that's what goes into this soup of value. Now, what agency principals can do is they can look at best practices metrics, things that the Big I does and puts out, and they're metrics to determine agency quality. What are the revenues per employee? What kind of production scales are they? Are you efficient? Are you growing? What's your loss ratio trends? What does it look like over time? And folks always want to ask me, well, how do I know if I'm any good relative to other folks? Well, use best practices as a proxy, and then you can sort of figure out where you are on some of these metrics.
The more you talk, though, the more I begin to realize the complexity of this thing. And think if I had an agency and I were going to sell it, I would have to have help. I mean, this is the average agent wouldn't know any of these things. Most of these things, I wouldn't think.
You know what, George? For a lot of folks, they do this transaction once. So why not do it right and get the right kind of advice and counsel and the right folks on your side? And there are strategies for enhancing value. And some of them, a lot of agencies I talk to, they say, well, I don't want to borrow money. And I say, well, if you borrowed money to buy a book, and that book added $500,000 of revenue to your agency, and you knew you were going to be able to sell it at 2.5 times, would you make that investment?
Huh.
Well, yeah, maybe I would.
Sure.
Right? And so leverage isn't necessarily bad. And I use a couple. You can use leverage to grow revenue. You can use leverage to hire folks to improve your efficiencies, because you can use leverage to get more efficient, reduce your costs, which does what? Improves your cash flow, which has a multiplier to it. So every dollar you save or every dollar you create in profitability has a multiplier of value when you come to the point in time where you're going to monetize it or sell. And so there are lots of options. And if I told you that there were ways for you to reap the benefits by borrowing money, you might, as an agency principal, go down that path. I want to talk a little bit briefly about accessing capital in the marketplace, and there's only a couple places where you can get money. If you don't have it buried in your backyard in a coffee can, you can talk to the seller about his willingness to provide capital if you're a buyer. Banks, obviously, like us. If you do have that coffee can, well, you can cut a check yourself. And then there's all kinds of combinations of getting capital to buy or capital to perpetuate. And deals are all over the map. You can get 100% of financing from a bank. You can get 100% of this from the seller. And sometimes you can get a little bit from both. It really ends up being tied to the type of transaction and really what the situation with the agency happens to be. When you talk in terms of capital, there's really only three things for folks to concentrate on. How much, how long, and what am I giving up? And so that becomes the loan duration, the rates and the fees, and am I giving you my firstborn in order to have this work? And whether you have an SBA loan or a bank loan, these are all different things. When I talk about terms and conditions, we try to have those discussions way up front. What folks need to do if they're a buyer, they have to prepare for telling a story to a bank or to a lender on why they're such a good risk. And really it comes down to your personal financial situation, your credit score. Do you have any liquidity? Do you have a lot of debt? What's the risk appetite of your spouse? Honey, we're not going to take vacation for the next 5 years because I'm buying the agency that I work at. That might cause a problem at home because there's short-term sacrifices for long-term success. So folks need to have a good sense. You also have to be able to prepare really good financial information, tax returns and personal PFS, personal financial statement, clear and concise and to the point, because you're telling a story about why you're a good risk. On the sell side, it's all the same similar things. How do I tell the story about how great my agency is? How good is my financial reporting and my agency managing reporting? Am I in trust? What have my trends been? And do I have, again, pro forma statements put in place that tell the true story about what my agency is all about? And that's why having a valuation is critical, because it's a third party who says, hey, this is how we're doing. And this is what makes the world go round.
Let me ask a question right here. Generally, when you when you have somebody come and see you, does the agent himself or herself talk to you, or do you generally deal with the third party?
No, we're always dealing with the agency principal. I almost never talk to the agency valuation firm. We take that information as part of our package. Everything we're doing is trying to understand what the best situation is for that agency principal or the person who's buying that agency.
Okay.
And what we're looking at is all the things you would look at, George, if you were going to buy an agency.
Sure.
Who am I buying? What am I buying? What's the basis of this valuation? That's how a banker should be thinking about this. And that's why InsurBanc got into business, because it's like we understand this, and so we can have discussions about what's going on at that agency. So we're looking at cash flow, and we're looking at how much cash flow is available to pay the bills. That's a debt service. And we want to make sure you've got enough cash in the business to run it. We want to make sure you're in trust, and you've got skin in the game, and you've got equity, and that your assumptions are realistic. If you buy an agency and say, I'm going to grow it 50% in year one, well, that may not be realistic. And it probably isn't. And we don't want to have a disappointment in future assumptions right out of the get-go. So those are important things. The package of information you would provide to a banker is similar to what you would provide in order to tell a story about the quality of the agency. And it's lots of financial statements, and it's lots of thought that goes into agencies who have a better or easier time borrowing money, either for a perpetuation or an acquisition, do a really good job of telling their story. And the banker looks at this and says, I got it, I understand it, and I'm willing to make an investment. And they should be asking you questions as a borrower about your carriers and your markets and your retention experience and your loss ratios and your contingency history. If you're talking to a lender who asks you none of these questions, you're probably talking to a lender who doesn't understand what you do for a living. And that is a problem that's waiting to happen, because if a market softens and your revenues are down, somebody needs to explain to the bank what that means, and they may not understand it. We've had a number of clients come to us from banks who said, I got to get out of there. My bank really doesn't understand what I'm doing. They made the right decision for the wrong reasons.
That's just what I was going to mention to you. How many banks would understand this? I mean, this is so complex that the average bank along the way in a small town but it wouldn't have a
Well, you know what happens, George, is it's not that they make the wrong decision. They can make the right decision. They just make it for the wrong reasons. And as long as markets stay hard or business remains good, it's not an issue. But what happens when you have a big loss, unforeseen, and you don't have contingencies, in a given fiscal year, and they're looking at trend lines, and all of a sudden there's a pile of profitability that's not there, and you try to explain what a contingency is or a profit sharing is, and they don't get it, it becomes a fairly, it gets to be an interesting discussion, and so it's important that folks actually think this through as to where they borrow the money, not just the price or the structure, it's the who, just like anything else.
Well, that's what, this next subject, this next slide here is exactly what brought my question up. Do you have a checklist that you give to an agency that asks for these things?
Yeah, what we do is we want them to have thought this through, and that they have there's a strategy to what they're trying to do and how they want to create value over time and ultimately how they plan on harvesting. And sometimes they don't have the answers, but that's okay. We want to have the dialogue that says, well, you think about this, think about that, because if passing ownership interests efficiently are important, which they are, that means values maximized and the deal sustainable for both the buyer and the seller. That means there's been a lot of thought that's gone into it, and folks have really spent time figuring out what the pitfalls might be or what they need to do in order to improve the process. When you plan ahead for a transaction, whether it's to buy something or to perpetuate your own agency, I cannot overemphasize this advice from real consultants who understand agency valuation, as well as good advice from tax attorneys and CPAs. And while your brother-in-law might be a great guy, he may be the last person on earth to have his advice and counsel as your CPA on a transaction, because transaction advice is different than plain old tax advice. And it may be different when you think about your legal advice as well, because there's a lot of different things that come into play when you're talking about transactions. And as I said before, if you only do this once, George, you want to get it right. And this is something that understanding what's going to happen after the transaction takes place, whether you're involved as the seller, well, how are the folks you bought going to be involved? So depending on what hat you wear, it's not just the preamble to getting a deal done. It's, okay, what happens on day one when we've actually done this deal? Who's out, who's in, who's sort of in, what are the expectations, who's doing what? If I'm buying my dad out, does he still get the same parking spot? Does he still get the same office? Does he still get the same? It's things like that happen in real life, and these are things that need to be discussed. And as I said before, and I'll just repeat it one more time, oftentimes because you only do this once in your career, it's best to do it right. And there are really good advice regionally around the country who are available, who can do this sort of thing. And we at the bank do a lot of sort of free counseling. We get calls from folks who say, I'm thinking about this, and we'll say, well, think about that, and here's what you need to look at. And we're talking to people today about deals that started 5 years ago. And that's okay. That's what we're here for. That's why the big guy made the investment in putting InsurBanc together, and hopefully, we can do it for a long time going forward.
Well, I'm sure you can, but let me just suggest that go back to one slide, if you will, please. Just go back to where we were, just one right there. Okay. We just had an interview here on Monday morning about a month ago or so from Al Diamond, who's the agency consulting group down in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. And one of the things that Al has been doing for years and years, which I think is just fascinating, is that he does an annual evaluation for a number of agencies. I don't know how many, because I think he's done like 500 over there. And that annual evaluation, you say, well, why do I just want to pay that kind of money for? I think that's an ideal move on the part of an agent, wouldn't you?
Yeah, if you look at this slide, I have your strategy should be reviewed on a regular basis.
Yep.
Your agency is constantly changing, markets are constantly changing, your carriers are changing, price points are changing, your customers are changing, and it cannot be static. It can't be. Your business isn't static, right? It's just not like I produce 100 widgets and then next year I produce 100 widgets and next year I produce 100 widgets and I know what they cost and I know how to do it. This is where folks make the mistake who are not familiar with the industry, and they don't understand how dynamic it is and how much it changes every day and every month, and how agencies, well, they may look very stable or they may look a certain way. Every year something changes, and so it's imperative to understand that your strategy, your value, all those things are impacted. And I think Al's spot on. I think there's a real value to understanding what's going on, in the marketplace. Like I said early on, if rates change, guess what? It changes the dynamic in the marketplace. Your agency may be doing exactly the same thing, and through no fault of your own, the value of that agency has either gone up or gone down because of things outside in the marketplace that are going on. And I think it's critical that folks do that.
I do too, and I'm very impressed now. If I were an agent, there's a contact with you. If I were an agent going to be selling, I think I might go, even if I was in Portland, Oregon or something, and you're in Connecticut, I still think should I contact you?
Yeah, we have clients in all 50 states, George. I travel all over. I do a lot of association meetings. We're fortunate to have the breadth and capability to do things nationally. And it doesn't matter if you're in Portland, Oregon, or Portland, Maine. We can take care of you.
Well, I believe it, and I'm very impressed. I mean, your presentation was just ideal, and I have learned more about buying and selling in the last 30 minutes than I have in a long, long time. And I'm glad you did. And I'll share this as much as I can. This goes out to 100,000 in money, but then we keep it, and we can have people refer to us. So I'm going to suggest to our agents, anybody who reads this, to take this recording and send it on to their accountant, to their banker, to their agency consultant, and I think everybody would be on the same wavelength. Don't you think it'd be a good idea?
Well, I think that, again, this topic is on everybody's mind, and, it's something that, we'll put it this way, everybody who owns a piece of an agency is a seller. It's just a matter of when and whether they're going to be there when it happens.
Amen. Okay, well, David, thank you again, and thanks to InsurBanc. And I am very impressed with your presentation, and I'm honored to have it. And for the rest of you, once again, we'll see you again next Monday morning.